Watercolor tree in 10 easy steps. That's what we're doing in today's video. Welcome back to my channel. If we haven't met before, my name is Michelle. On this channel you'll find all things watercolor and a little bit of mixed media too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell icon, you can get notified every time I have a new video for you, which is one free video a week here on YouTube every Thursday, with extra content on Saturdays for my Patreon subscribers. So usually on this channel I have separate videos for colour mixing, I have separate videos for drawing skills, and I have separate videos for painting, but we're kind of going to do it all in one today because I've been teaching people in the real world to paint for nearly 20 years now, and they come up with the same mistakes time and time again. So if I have, for instance, sounds depressing doesn't it, but if I have for instance seen 4,000 badly rendered tree paintings, then I haven't seen 4,000 different mistakes. I've probably seen 4 mistakes 1,000 times each, if you see what I mean. So there's something in the human brain, in the human psyche, in the way our vision works that means that we make the same mistakes over and over again. It's the same when I teach portrait painting, colour mixing, whatever it is, I see the same small selection of mistakes. So if you're watching my videos you think, well, how did she know I do that? It's because I see it time and time again. So I'm going to walk you through the basic techniques of painting a tree today, and I'm going to drop in these little mistakes that I see people make time and time again. I think by the time we get to the end of the video you're going to have a much more realistic, natural looking tree to put in your landscape paintings. So we're going to start with a few basic drawing techniques for trees. And the reason for this is if I teach you a whole video full of tree painting techniques, that's all very well, but if your tree's drawn in a way that just doesn't make it look realistic, then it's not going to work no matter how well you apply the paint. So the first tip I'm going to give you is a little tip about drawing the base of your tree trunks. So I've got a photograph here that I printed off from the computer. It's been heavily photoshopped in order to cut it out, so it has no background on it, which is why the trunk of the tree has just been chopped here as if it's literally been cut down. But the technique I want to show you is one of showing that the tree is growing into the ground by broadening it slightly at the trunk, at the base where it goes into the ground. So I've got a piece of bockingford which we're going to make our tree on, but I've also, and that photograph is just for inspiration, we're not going to do that exact tree, but just that sort of tree, you know, broad brown trunk and some branches and some loose leaves. So I've got some bockingford here that we're going to do our painting on, but I've also got some cartridge paper here just to show you some drawing techniques. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw our trunk, and as it comes up we're going to slightly tip it out at the base. This is a really good trick for making your tree look like it's growing into the ground, and you may sometimes find that you can actually see parts of the roots depending on, you know, where it's growing. Often in parks you can see trees like this, you can actually see the roots growing into the ground. You may also get trees where you don't see any of that, and they're these tall thin trees, sort of birch trees perhaps. So sometimes you get long thin trees that go straight up like this. They go up a long way before they have any branches. Nevertheless, if you're doing a whole sort of forest of these, you've got lots of them all growing together, if just now and again you can tip one of them out at the base like that, it's really going to help your tree to look like it's growing. And if you're just drawing a tree perhaps from memory or just some kind of generic tree, then as you take that trunk up, I want you just to tip it out a little bit at the base. It'll just help it look like it's rooted into the ground. So that's how we're going to start our tree, with a wide trunk that we're going to root slightly into the ground. And we're going to start to go up like this. Next I'm going to show you a really simple rule regarding how tree branches taper. Big branches taper, the tree trunk tapers, the little branches taper, the little branches on the little branches taper even more. It sounds really simple, you probably already knew it, but if you don't get it right in your drawing, then you're going to end up with a tree that looks very, very unrealistic. It's a rule actually that applies to almost every plant that exists. Now, before those of you that grow cacti and succulents and very strange shaped things get on at me in the comments, it's not an exact rule, it doesn't apply to everything, but it's a really, really good rule that you can apply to your tree branches and your tree trunks. That will really help them to look more realistic. Now, you probably already knew this. You're thinking, well, I already know that branches taper, but I have seen people get this wrong time and time again. So I'm going to show you with my pencil and explain to you exactly why it's so important to get this particular point right. So back to my scrap paper, and let me show you what I mean about things tapering. So of course you have a tree and it tapers as it goes up. But what you should also notice is that every branch that comes off of it also tapers as it goes out. And that trick that I showed you of the tree trunk widening at the base and going into the ground, you can also use that for these branches that come out here, because they're sort of almost rooted in the main trunk. So you can use that same idea when they're coming out on a side shoot like that. Looks like a person could draw a little face, couldn't I? That it gets narrow, and your branches get narrower from there, and every single branch that you add gets narrower. It starts narrower than the one it's on, and it gets narrower again. Now, as I said, it's something that you probably already knew, but the amount of times that I've seen people and they start to take a branch out and it starts sort of it starts going like that and getting wider, and really that doesn't ever happen. The only time something gets wider like that is if it's about to split into two. But if it's not splitting into two, then it won't ever get, on a standard tree, it won't ever get wider. So the other thing people do is they just don't take much care, and so the branch itself not only gets wider, it then gets narrower, and you know, it just starts to look very unnatural. So if you can remember that rule, that your branches and subsequent branches and sub twigs, as it were, get narrower each time they go along, then that'll help you to make your tree look realistic. And just be a little bit careful with your drawing, that you're not just sort of doing this and, you know, it's not looking very realistic. This next drawing tip regards the overall look of the tree. I see time and time again people drawing them either far too curvy or far too straight. Put that ruler away. So I'm going to show you a really simple thing that I figured out about tree branches that is going to make them look realistic for you every single time. So we've got these two tendencies with trees. We've got the tendency for the tree to be too straight, and we get something like this going on, and everything is just a bit too straight. You're not drawing with a ruler, but everything's straight. And then we get the other sort of tree drawn where people know that the tree curves, and so they'll draw everything curved. And I see this one more often actually, and everything is curved, because we know that tree branches, they go all over the place, don't they? And so they must curve at some point, and so we draw them curved. But you can see that neither of these two examples look particularly realistic. So something I figured out about tree branches is they're actually straight lines with kinks. So what happens with your tree branch is it grows towards the light, and then of course the sunlight moves, or perhaps the season changes and the branch changes direction, or maybe it starts to grow in one direction and then it comes up to another branch, and so it's going to kink around that branch so that it can continue to grow upwards and outwards and get to the light. So once you've understood that, what you understand about tree branches is that they start to go straight. Remember that we're getting them smaller each time they go along, and then they change direction. And so what you end up with are these kind of branches that go along for a bit and then kink suddenly. And so if this were, you know, a bigger tree, you're getting straight lines, so straight line, kink. And this is really how all of your tree branches end up growing. So you can see that if we can compare it to these two examples, I mean, obviously these are very simplistic, but if we compare it to these two examples where we've got everything straight, where everything's strangely curved, and now we've got this one here, which has straight lines, but then they kink. So you've got a straight line and then it kinks. And of course you can just follow the other side along like that. A straight line, then it kinks. And this helps you to understand exactly how trees grow and to get a more realistic look to how your branches and your trunk are laid out. So let's put that into practice now as we start to get our tree shape. And just like the one in the photograph, I'm going to have one big branch coming off the side here. So we're using both of those things that we've learned, that the tree branches get narrower and narrower as they go up, and that they sort of go up in a straight line and then they kink. So we're going to do the same thing here. And I'm just going to draw until I've got quite a lot of branches. So if you're wondering to yourself how much you draw, you don't have to draw all the tiny little twigs and branches. We're just going to put those in at the end with a brush. But what you're going to draw is the main branches, I should say. And that's what I'm going to do now, is I'm going to get on and just draw the main parts of our tree, the main structure and the widest main branches. And for the last part of our tree drawing, we're going to be looking at leaving gaps so that you can put the leaves on top. Now, watercolor's tricky, it's transparent. So if you just draw a load of tree branches and a tree trunk and then you put the leaves on top, you know, one of two things is going to happen. If the paint's dark enough, it's going to cover up all of the branches, and branches always show through trees, and you know, you can see them in the gaps between the leaves, so that's not going to look realistic. If the watercolor paint is light and transparent, what's going to happen is the tree trunks are all going to show through, and it's going to look very, very strange indeed. So I'm going to show you now how, as part of the drawing from the very beginning, when you plan your tree, you can leave those gaps so that you're going to get a tree that's got natural sort of holes in it, you can see through to the sky, and you're going to get branches in those gaps. So I've got an outline of my tree sketched out. Now do remember that when I draw for YouTube, I have to press a bit harder so that you can see on camera. I would advise with any pencil drawing that you're doing for watercolour painting, keep it as light as possible because you've got less chance of it being left on the paper at the end of the painting. Now I want gaps so that I get areas where there are leaves in front of branches, and then I get areas where the branches are showing through. Now, if as I had drawn this, I had left a gap, say here, I'd left a gap from here, I started drawing this branch and then I pick my pencil up and I restart drawing it up here. That's all very well, but the chances are I may end up with one not really being aligned to the other. So it's better to sort of draw through all of those areas. And then what I like to do is get an eraser and just, you know, just knock some holes in it here and there. If I leave those pencil lines on, what's going to happen is they may well show through the paint, especially as I'll be using yellow and some cadmium colours. And they have a tendency actually to block the pencil in because they can be rather opaque. So I'm looking at now at breaking up this initial drawing. As I said, there's some pencil left, but that's partly because I have to draw a little bit more firmly so that you can see on camera. And I'm getting this idea now that we're going to break up this tree so that we just get a few of the branches showing through the gaps. Try to do it so there are areas kind of connecting to each other, like this one around here, and then it'll look fairly natural when you are applying your leaves. Now if you're drawing from a particular photograph, I'm just trying to do sort of a generic tree here, but if you're drawing from a particular photograph, you can be guided by what's actually showing on your photograph and which parts are showing as, you know, leaves, and you can't see the stems and the branches, and then you can be guided by areas where the branches are actually showing through. But it can always be helpful. It's always difficult with things to draw along and then leave a gap and continue that thing. It's always better if you can to draw through and then rub out the bits you don't need. So now I've got my my tree, I've got my branches, and I've got some gaps ready to put leaves in. Next, we're going to have a little bit of a colour mixing tutorial with regard to tree trunks. Now, often the colours that you get ready-made in a beginner set aren't quite right for tree trunks. And whilst you do get tree trunks of different colours, you get white ones and you get light brown ones. The far majority of them are dark brown. So I'm going to give you some recipes for mixing a really natural looking dark brown tree trunk colour, with the caveat that there is no correct colour for a tree trunk. You know, I hate to see on Facebook and people go into the watercolour groups and they'll ask for a colour. They'll say, which colour do I need for sunsets? What's the colour for shadows? You know, which colour do I need for this sort of flower? And whilst you can answer those questions with some degree of accuracy, you'll never be 100% accurate. You know, the truth is there are probably tens of thousands of species of tree on the planet. And when you look at that particular tree species and the particular colour of the trunk, then you've got to think about the time of year, the refraction of the light, is there direct sunlight on it, even the person who's looking at it and how they interpret it, whether there's moss growing on it. So I'm not telling you here that there's one colour for tree trunks, there is not. And as you move forward and as you learn more about painting, it's a really, really good idea to get so that you can analyse colours yourself. But when you're just starting out, that can be really tricky. So I'm going to give you some tips here that will get you a lovely natural dark brown for your tree trunks. So let's have a look at the colours that you might traditionally find in a small beginner's box, shall we say. Now, one of the most common ones is this one here, and this is burnt umber, and this might be the one, being probably the only dark brown you've got, this might be the one that you would select for a tree trunk. And it's not too bad. It is, however, a little bit warm and a little bit unnatural. Other colours that you might have might be even more warm. So I've got here, I think this one is burnt sienna. This one's going to be even more reddish and a bit too weak as well. Another colour which you might have, which is actually more suitable but only for light coloured trees, is this one here. This is raw umber. Forgive me if you can hear pigeons literally running around on the roof at the moment. So that's not a bad colour for trees. You can see it's a little cooler than these and it's still quite pale. The one that I favour more often is this one here, which is sepia. Now, do you see the difference? Do you see how much more suitable it is? It's very dark, it's very strong, but it's also much cooler and much more of a natural tree trunk colour. Now, if you have a beginner's set, it's unlikely that you have this colour, and if you do have it, it may not look like mine. That's because sepia is what they call a mixed colour. So in other words, it depends on the recipe that the individual manufacturer sticks to, depending on what sort of colour their sepia is. Sepia can vary an awful lot between brands. So I'm going to show you a way of adjusting your burnt umber, that's the dark brown that is almost in every set. I'm going to show you a way of adjusting your burnt umber so that you can make it cooler and darker. So we're going to add blue to our brown to cool it down, and let me explain to you why that's going to work. Now, brown is a neutral, it's a mixed colour. In other words, it's got all three of the primaries in it, more towards the red yellow end than the blue end. If I were to mix the same mix to make brown, in other words red, yellow, blue, but I put a lot more blue in, then I would get grey. So therefore, if we tip the balance of the three primaries that are in the brown more towards the blue end of the spectrum, we'll push the colour more towards grey. So we'll go from this sort of chocolatey colour, this warm reddish brown, and we'll go more to a neutral grey toned brown. So we're going to add blue, but we don't want to just use any blue. Now, because brown has a lot of yellow in it, you can see how much yellow is in this. If I just add blue to it, I could end up getting green. Now, a way of making sure that that doesn't happen is to use a red-based blue. If you don't know what I'm talking about, basically ultramarine. If you haven't got ultramarine, I'd be very surprised if you don't have ultramarine. If you don't have ultramarine, then choose cobalt, because that one's very close to it. What you don't want to use is one of the turquoise colours, such as cerulean, phthalo or manganese, because they have already got a bit of yellow in, and if you start messing around with those and putting them in browns, you could well end up with green. So let's take our warm brown. So I've got here, this is Talon's Rembrandt Burnt Umber. Again, it's a lovely colour, but it's just not overly realistic for tree trunks. You know, there's no one colour. You may find a tree trunk that is this colour, but generally speaking, you're going to want to cool it down a little bit. What I've done is I've just put a little bit of ultramarine out. So I've got this Jackman's Art Materials. This is their French ultramarine. If you're wondering the difference between ultramarine and French ultramarine, ultramarine tends to have a little bit less of the red in, and French ultramarine has a little bit more. In other words, it looks a bit more purple, and that's actually to the advantage here, because we're looking for that red element to counteract and stop us from going into green. So if I just take a little bit of this paint, which I've already put out on my palette, and I start adding it to this brown, can you see what happens? I'm just mixing on the paper here, but can you see how much cooler that brown has become? So I'll show you it without the blue in it. So we've got this here, and then I'll show you it when we mix a bit of blue in it. Don't forget, if you go into the video description, you can get a 10% discount off of Jackman's paints as well. And then I'm going to add this ultramarine here. And can you see how we've cooled that down? We've almost made sepia. So if you don't own a cool dark brown and you would like to make one, you just get your ultramarine or cobalt and drop it in to your burnt umber. So let's get on and apply our tree trunk colour. I'm going to show you a really simple way of lifting out a highlight with the brush so that you can get the tree trunks looking more curved and more three-dimensional. However, texture on tree trunks is a whole video in itself, and luckily for you, I already made that one. So I'm going to link to that one up above, and I'll put it on the end cards, in the description, in the pinned comment. I'll put it everywhere so that you can watch that one if you'd like to after this one. If you click any of those information cards above, you don't go off this video, it just lines it up so that you can watch it later on. But I'm just going to show you the basic way of applying the tree trunk colour and the basic way of lifting out highlights. And to lift out a highlight in certain areas that I'm going to show you in a second, this will make your tree trunks look three-dimensional. I had some ultramarine left on my palette, so I mixed it in with the burnt umber. As I said, I might usually use sepia, but I don't like wasting paint. So let's paint our tree. So I'm going to show you how to not only to mold it, but how to fade out certain areas. So I don't want to have a a straight edge here. It would look really hard and unnatural. So what I'll probably do is start on some wet paper. So I'm going to wet the bottom here, and then I'm going to go in with the paint. I've got some kitchen paper in case my brush gets too wet, and I'm just going to start spreading along and up. Now as I take the paint up, and I'm going to avoid it, you know, drying in some weird place like here, I'm going to keep that edge wet, but just as I'm going up and out, I'm going to occasionally clean my brush, dry my brush slightly, and take out a bit of a highlight, particularly perhaps towards the middle of the trunk or even down one side, so that I start to get more of a three-dimensional look. And of course this is a tree, you know, it doesn't have to be, we don't want any uncomfortable drying lines, but we don't have to worry if there's a bit of texture in it, you know, if there's a bit of a back run somewhere, it really won't matter. As I said, I do have a video that's all about tree bark techniques, so I can give you some pointers of really more interesting ways of making your tree bark look, but for this one here I'm just giving you a basic application. Now we're getting close to this area where I have rubbed out some of the branch, so again I'm going to go in there with a bit of clean water and perhaps just leave those areas a little bit blank. You never want that hard edge, so we're looking at getting that kind of gap, that soft kind of gap in between the water there. I'll take a bit of water along here so that there's nowhere where you get a hard drying line that's going to appear through your paint. You'll be amazed, even if you've used a light colour and you're going over the top with a darker colour, you can really easily end up with seeing a drying line of some uncomfortable shape through. So if you have to go behind something, always best just to fade out there with a bit of water. And we're coming up here to two more areas again where I faded out. So here for instance I can come in from the top here, and then I can just change to clean water and just come along so that I'm getting those areas where the paint, it may not be completely disappeared, but it's just a little bit lighter. Another thing I can do if I want to is just go down one side perhaps with a bit of dark. Now again, technically this is half dry now, so I don't want that hard drying line, but you know, I can just fill that in, even that out with a bit of water. So we're looking at this idea of taking the brush, the damp brush, and lifting out on one or two places. I mean, you have to decide where you think the light is coming from. We can also as well, if we want to, get kind of a dappled effect by blotting like this. So I'm going to get on now and paint the rest of my main tree branches, leaving those gaps now and again so that we can get our leaves in. At this point, if you're getting some value from this video, can I ask you for a favour? Can you click the like button please? Because YouTube rewards channels with audience interaction, so if you like, share, subscribe or leave me a comment, YouTube will push this video out to more people. I can teach more people to paint and my channel will continue to grow. I've got 14,000 subscribers at the moment, so I'm really pleased and so grateful to all of you. So I talked once in a video about Teletubby trees, these kind of rounded blocky trees like I used to see in the TV programme that my daughter watched, and I wasn't sure if people in Australia and America had heard of the Teletubbies, but I'm pretty sure from the comments that they seem to have infected the whole world now. So if I say Teletubby trees, you probably Teletubby trees, you probably know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about those trees, and you might have made them yourself. I also used to call them lollipop trees. So you've got the main tree trunk, and then you've just got this blob on the top. So if you have this problem and your tree doesn't look natural, because trees have raggedy edges, they have leaves and they have gaps. So I'm going to show you some ways of doing this now, both with a standard watercolor brush, and I'm going to introduce you to a couple of other types of brushes that might give you a better effect as well. So beginners often struggle to get texture and gaps in their tree leaves. I'm going to show you some techniques and some brushes. So I would often just paint a tree with this brush here just by using kind of a broken application, but you can also use other brushes that are a little bit rougher in order to apply. Now you can get special brushes for painting trees, and these are often what they call a rake. So a rake would be a flat brush with gaps in. This brush here is actually a fan brush, and I have hacked into it myself with, you know, with a little pair of nail scissors. So you can use that shape brush as well, and because there's a slight curve to it, that can look good too. If you get a fan shaped brush where the edge is even, they can look a little bit uncomfortable. So you might want to be brave and attack it a little bit. Any brush really can be used for trees, especially sort of scruffy, rough old acrylic brushes, things with the bristles sprayed out, they can really be good too. So I'll show you how I use a standard brush first of all. And I'm just going to grab some ready-made green here, and I can just apply in sort of a semi-gappy manner. Another thing that's a good thing to do is to mix on the paper. Now this is a ready-made green, but I could go in with a little bit of something. I'm grabbing a little bit actually of, I think it's a Perylene Violet, and I could just drop in a little bit of something, cool that down. I could equally go in with some yellow ochre as well. So I could just apply the paint in a manner that was somewhat gappy and mix the colours on my paper. And you see there already I get a much more varied application than if I were just using a single colour and sort of allowing my brush to make swirling shapes. So let's look at the other brushes now. This brush here, I find this is really good for willow trees. I don't know if you have those in the country where you live, but we have willow trees. They call them weeping willows, and they have these sort of long fronds that come down. This can also be good for winter trees where you can just see lots and lots of very fine branches. So let's look at how we use it. So we can use it quite wet, and again I can go into some ready-made green here, and we can apply it like this. We can apply it in sort of curved shapes if we want to. We can also, as I said, if I use something more like a little bit of sepia here and dry the brush a bit more, we can get a dry brush effect where you might have those distant trees where you have branches coming out like so, or things growing up. So that's another way of using it. But like I said, you can also use it a little bit wetter and apply the paint like that. You can see why the broken edge is quite important. Even with that, it's a little bit regular. Another thing you can do is to use an old toothbrush. Now I keep these mostly for splattering, but you can actually paint with them too. So if I dip in here, I've got a little bit of that sepia I had before, and let's get a bit of green in with it as well. And we can actually, you have to press quite hard, but you can actually, a bit more sepia there just because it's available and it's wet. So any one of these can be used, as well as all sorts of rough, scruffy acrylic brushes. So if you're finding that with an ordinary brush your application is still a bit too smooth, you can make the effect much looser just by forcing yourself to use a really old, rough, scruffy brush. Now, if there wasn't one colour for tree trunks, that applies even more so with leaves, because obviously you get trees with red leaves, you get all sorts of things, but we're just going to put the standard types of green leaves that you might often see in summer trees today. So I'm going to give you a few hints about colour mixing. If you find particularly that your trees are always that kind of really bright day glow green, perhaps you're using some of those ready mixed tube greens, you just can't dull them down. I'm going to give you a little tip for doing that. I'm also going to show you a way of applying the green, and what we're going to do is we're going to apply the blues and yellows straight to the paper without pre-mixing. Sounds a bit scary, but actually it's going to give you such a lovely mottled look to your trees. It's going to be really, really effective. So back to our tree. Now, if you find that you're always getting that green that's far too bright, it may be a tube green that you want to adjust, or it may just be a green that you're mixing yourself, try defaulting to ultramarine. Now, ultramarine, because it's got that touch of red in that we talked about earlier, it's going to dull your green down. So I'm going to actually mix my own tree colour here. I'm going to use lemon and ultramarine, but you can use any yellow and ultramarine. As I said, all sorts of combinations can be used for trees. I've already got a little bit of blue in here, so I'm going in really with a little bit of this greenish yellow, and I'm going to go straight onto the paper. Don't be afraid of doing this. If you go onto the paper with yellow and you put blue on top, then green will appear. It absolutely must. You know, even if something goes wrong, if you have to answer the doorbell, or you know, you end up letting the paint dry, it will still go to green when you add the blue. Now, disclaimer here, this isn't ultramarine because I've just realised, so this is cobalt. I might add, I've got some ultramarine in a tube that I was using earlier, so I might put some of that out in a minute. So cobalt is fairly close as well. So any of those red based blues are going to give you really natural looking greens, and then we can just go in and keep balancing out and putting the paint colours on. If that's still a bit too bright, what we can do is we can go in with something like some Payne's Grey or some purple, or something that will just cool that green down a little bit. So I'm popping my colours in there and allowing them to mix on the paper. And you can actually, you know, you can let areas dry and then you can add more paint in. Anything that you would normally be worried about avoiding, like a back run, can actually look really fantastic when it comes to trees. So we're going to be adding our yellows and blues and perhaps some other colours that will sort of dull things down a little bit directly to the paper. Now when it comes to gaps, the majority of the gaps are going to be on the outside. So I'm going to continue now adding that blue and adding that yellow directly to the paper. So whilst we're applying these greens, let's look at using some techniques to get highlights and shadows within the trees. Now with tree trunks and things like bushes and shrubberies, what you find is that the shadows tend to be lower down and they tend to be in the centre where it's more dense, and the lighter areas tend to be towards the edges. So let me show you how you do that as you're applying your green paint. So of course, as the sun hits a tree, it's going to hit the outside. Any plant, any sort of foliage or bush, the sun is going to hit the outside. So you're looking at placing the yellows towards the outside. I'm going to go up actually into this cadmium yellow light here, which is a little bit more sunny and a little bit brighter. I'm going to pop some of that around the edge. Now conversely, I'm looking at getting the darks in the centre of the tree. So again, adding this around here. I might also blot some of these areas out here. An interesting thing happens when you blot a green like this. Often the blue lifts out and the yellow remains behind, so you can end up with this lovely sort of light effect. And although I don't generally like this blotting technique for things like clouds, it's actually fantastic for trees because you get these hard edged little shapes that are very reminiscent of leaves, and you can just keep continuing to work. All of these things that you normally worry about, you don't have to worry about as much. If it's looking a bit too gappy, for instance, I can put some clean water on and just allow areas to bleed together. Now I want to get some shadow. Now shadow is generally in the middle, so we're going to go a little bit darker in the middle. I could just go with more blue, but I'm actually going to add a little bit of Payne's grey as I go down. So let's work some, start getting some green down here. So look how blue that is. So we're not going to panic. We're just going to put a little bit of the yellow into it and allow it to bleed in. So looking at joining these areas here, so you want to eventually build up so there are far less gaps in the middle. There will still be a few, but there's going to be less. So don't overdo it, just go in gradually so you don't take too much out. Now Payne's grey has got a lot of blue pigment in, so we can use it for shadows. But there are other options. You could just use more blue, you could just use darker paint. You could also, as I said, use something like a purple that would just cool the whole area down. I'm going to go in places with that Payne's grey. You don't want to overdo the Payne's grey, it can look very heavy. So we're going in down here. You can also, if you want to, imagine perhaps that your tree is darker on this side and the light's coming in from the other side. It really depends, it depends what's going on there. Try not to go in with 5 different blues and 4 different yellows. It ends up sort of not hanging together very well. So I'm going to keep building that up. I don't like the way at the moment that this is very regular up here, so I'm going to get a little bit of that lighter paint on my brush, and I'm going to sort of break it up a little bit so that it's a bit less regular. And let's take some out this side as well. You don't have to worry if there are little gaps here. We can put branches in later on. And also just getting that idea that there are lots of individual leaves. If there's a leaf here, don't worry, the human brain will join it up to the tree and it will be absolutely fine. You don't have to worry about that. It's a bit blue over here, so I'm going to put a little bit of yellow on. Really just adjusting as you go. Got a lot more freedom with a tree like this. You don't have to worry too much, that it's a sky and everything's drying and it needs to be more even. You can just keep working on it until you're happy with it, but of course you want to be careful not to overwork it. So again, I'm going to go in with these darker tones. I've got some very wet Payne's grey here. I'm just dripping it in wherever I see it. Really good idea to allow some uneven drying levels here and just to allow some areas to drift into others without blocking out all of the light. So you want to keep working on that until in the center you've got very few gaps, but perhaps 1 or 2, and around the outside you've got a lot more gaps. But even where there are no gaps, you still want to get this variation. That's another delight of using ultramarine. It's such a granulating color that you're going to get a lot of texture anyhow. As I said, you can continue to go in if you want to. If it's looking a bit flat in places, you can get some blotted shapes into. In a more complex painting that's not just a demonstration for YouTube, I might as well go back in and put more tree texture in. There's all sorts of things I could do. Of course, I'd probably as well be putting a little bit of a base down here for my tree to sit on. Now, when it comes to things like sky, you should really have already put that in, because where you have gaps here, I'm just doing this on white paper so you can see it clearly, but where you have gaps here, you would of course like to see the sky through them. So with a painting like this, you want to apply your sky first and bring it down, just fade it down. And certainly with a green tree like this, it'll easily sit on top of that light blue sky. So we're starting to get a nice looking tree, but what about all those little tiny branches? Now you really don't have to paint every single branch and every single leaf, but we are going to put a few more small branches in at this stage. So what about those little branches? So I would usually actually make sure that this was dry, but because it's YouTube, time is marching on here, the light levels are going, I'm going to work in it wet. But when you get to this stage, it would be best for you to let it dry at that point. I've still got a lot of dry paper in the gaps, so that's going to be fine. So I haven't gone down to a smaller brush. I don't need to really, because this one's got a point on. I've just got some sepia now, and I'm just going to start putting in some additional branches in the gaps. As I said, the human eye will fill in the gaps. You do not have to make everything work. You can see I'm just using the edge of the brush here to get these quite natural little shapes. You don't have to join up every single leaf to another leaf. Your brain will work it out, but you're just going in and perhaps getting, you know, in some of these gaps in the middle here and some of these outside edges, you're just getting those little branch shapes going on. You know, you might find that they come through like this or even go across. Try to always remember that, you know, a branch has to connect to the rest of the branch. You don't ever want to be just dropping in lines without some thought at least that they're going somewhere. You can take them over if you've got sort of, if you've got lighter leaves like this, you know, you can in places take them over the top, but you also want to break them up and get them coming through as well. Now you can see I'm getting some bleeding there as I apply because I didn't wait for it to dry. You know, it looks quite nice. It just depends how loose or how sort of tight you want your tree to look. And then you're just adding those little branches as you go along. As you get towards the end of the painting, you just want to consider as well if perhaps you want to, in places, you know, strengthen this tree trunk. Has it gone a little bit pale? Has it dried a little bit pale? Perhaps you want it to be a little bit stronger. So you're looking at just putting these final tonal contrasts into your painting and strengthening any areas that you think need strengthening. And as you can see, if you've ended up in the past with trees that just look like a big clump of green where there's no variation, no gaps for leaves, you can see that to use some of these very simple techniques can get you a really good result. Do let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this step-by-step tree tutorial and if it's given you any tips for using in your own landscape paintings. As always, thank you so much for all of my Patreon subscribers. Do have a look before you go, by the way, in the video description, because I've got some free things for you down there. I've got some free downloadable PDFs that you can grab, and also you can have a look at my courses and my longer form content that's available to Patreon subscribers. I mentioned at the start that I had a video that would teach you lots of different really cool texture and tree bark techniques for those trees that are really up close to you. You can have a look at that video right now.